weeping, which crying, does that sound awesome or lame? Lame. And there's gnashing of teeth. We're not sure what gnashing of teeth means. We just know it's bad. And here's a couple images you can think of to get this in your head. When dogs fight over food, they're gnashing teeth at each other. They're showing their teeth, they're fighting. Would you want to be in the middle of like lions fighting over the carcass of a gazelle? No. Or another possible image is gnashing of teeth is when your teeth are chattering because you're so cold. Because when you're in the outer darkness, you're not next to a fire. And in the ancient world, fire was equated with heat because they didn't have central. And so you're in the outer darkness away from a fire and you're so cold and you're so shivering, your teeth shiver. There's this Russian author by the name of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And you know how the Gospel of John uses light and darkness. Light is good, darkness is evil, and he uses the imagery. In Solzhenitsyn, he talks about heat and warmth being good and cold being evil. And the reason is he was a political prisoner in the Gulag in Siberia, and they would just have less clothes than I have on now, and they would wake up and work as soon as possible so they wouldn't freeze to death. And they were cold all the time. So for years and years, some of you guys cold plunge, right? What if you cold plunged for years involuntarily? I mean, I'm exaggerating because you'd be dead, but that gives you the feeling of what it would be like. And so for him, coldness was trauma itself, and coldness became evil itself, and it symbolized itself that way in his writings. So weeping and gnashing of teeth, it's just bad. You know, Christians argue about heaven and hell a lot. Is hell the eternal conscious no torment? Is it annihilation? Heaven? Is it a bunch of fat babies playing harps in heaven, flying around with little wings? You know? Here's the big idea, and this is the culmination of years of theological study, okay? Heaven, good. Hell, bad. Okay? There is a place called hell because Jesus talks about it. I think it might be Central California, but that's in the Greek. Well, I won't get into the details, but I'm pretty sure. But heaven, good, hell, bad. And it's weird because we live in an age where everybody's a universalist and everybody believes everybody's going to heaven. It's cool that you believe that. I hope it brings you comfort. Jesus disagrees. He actually talks about a place called hell several times, and it's always lame. It's always bad. It's outer darkness. It's weeping. It's gnashing of teeth. There's fire, and you're like living in the fire. And he's not literally explaining it, but the fact that he's not literally explaining it doesn't make it better. Here's why. When we resort to poetry and simile and metaphor and all this imagery, it's because we want you to feel what we felt when we felt what we felt. That was really weird. But it's because I don't have the words to tell you what it was I saw. You can't get it. So I'm going to use poetry to get you there. So I saw this one show where this guy went and he saw the Taj Mahal. And this guy hated India. He hated India. He thought it was dirty and noisy, and he was an introvert, and he just didn't like it. There were people everywhere, just people everywhere. These cities are so densely populated, and he hated it. And he got to the Taj Mahal, and it's like he had been raptured somewhere. I mean, he couldn't believe what he was looking at. I mean, the buildings were just so beyond anything he could have ever imagined in beauty. And when he was trying to describe it, he didn't say, yeah, well, it was a block made out of this, and it was shaped like that. I mean, he didn't do a literal description. When he tried to description, he goes, no, you can't understand. If you were there, it was like just a wall of ice that stretched to the heavens, and the sun would dance off the top of it. And to fix the top of these were like these upturned onion types things, but the way they were decorated, it looked like the crown of the gods themselves were descending upon and shining their light upon you. And he uses all his poetry to describe it, because he can't just use words, he has to get images. So when he's describing the Taj Mahal with poetry, his language takes you this far, because he's trying to get you to understand that the truth is somewhere over here. And that's what poetry does. So when Jesus uses metaphor about heaven, no more sorrow, no more pain, there will be no more sea there, which means there won't be chaos, there won't be tsunamis, there won't be flood and devastation and death. There will be a river going through the middle of it, and there will be fruit there to feed the nations with. And God will himself will be his God. Or you talk about when Jesus appears in the book of Revelation, it says, well, it was like the sun, and his feet were like bronze, and he was standing on 7 gold lampstands. He's saying radiance, light, power. His voice was like the rushing of many waters, like the sound of many trumpets. And when I saw him, I felt as though dead. See, when they're using this imagery, they're not saying, hey, Jesus is kind of strong when he comes back and he decides to be king. He's saying, okay, here's as much imagery as I could tell you. He's riding a war horse, a sword's coming out of his mouth, his face is shining like the sun in all his brilliance. Everyone tries to run from him. He slays all his enemy, and the blood comes up to the horse's mouth, and it goes up for a couple hundred miles. It's insane. Right? You get the image that if you can get that inch he's trying to give you with poetry and walk another 1,000 miles, that's what he's talking about. So is Jesus a king? Yeah, first time he came back a very humble Galilean peasant. Second time he comes back, not so much. Which means when he talks the other direction, he says, well, it's like outer darkness. It's like eternal fire. It's like weeping, and it's like gnashing of teeth. It makes it worse because he's just taking you an inch and you're supposed to go 1,000 more miles that way to understand what he's talking about. So let me revise all my theology, okay? Heaven, really good. Hell, really bad. And so Jesus is saying here, he's the king. He has authority to include in his kingdom whomever he wants. And that will include Gentiles from all over the world, which I'm grateful for. What about you guys? I'm not Jewish. I'm not. So I'm glad that I get to be included in this because of Jesus. Now let me talk about authority before we get out of here for a minute. Again, we live in a culture where authority is confused, and we just don't like the concept overall. But authority is a real thing. There are people in charge, and there's people not in charge. And there's things you're responsible for, and there's things you're not responsible for. Right? So let's start inside and just move out. Okay, first off, authority, think of it like authorship. Like if somebody writes a book, they're the author. Okay, so the stories that you have the power you're supposed to tell, that's the authority in your life. So, let's see. Dave's back. Dave and Sue are back. Are you guys happy? I think they're clapping for Sue. So, if I don't have the authority to decide how they're going to spend the next year of their life. If I did, they'd be here all year, right? But a couple months they're going to hit the road again. But if I had the authority, I would write that story for them. But do I? No, they have the authority to write their story, and God's entrusted me with this tiny corner of the universe where I write mine. So the first thing about authority is that you have some. You've been entrusted with some. And you're responsible for whatever authority God has given you. See, the Roman centurion couldn't just tell people go and come and do whatever he wanted them to do. He was also responsible for the decisions he made. And a lot of people who have had, well, it doesn't matter. A lot of people feel like the locus of control is outside of their life, and that things outside of their life determine how their story is written. And it's a very helpless, victimized place to be. And you know, sometimes this is true. Sometimes a person's life is so difficult and so hard, and they grow up in such a terrible system and such a bad social situation that they don't have a chance. That happens. And I'm not just talking about like some third world planet like Jupiter or whatever. It happens here too. But by and large, even people who have had very difficult lives, they still have authority over their own life, and they're supposed to write their own life. And God entrusted you with your life. And so you have to answer for your own life. You have authority over it. And you can't, when you face Jesus on Judgment Day, you can't say, well, I tried to delegate my life to these other people to decide it. Because he'll say, I'm not talking to them. Right? We're accountable for our own lives. And there's grace for that. But there should also be encouragement that whatever life God has given you to live, you need to spend it in a way that is faithful. You know, a lot of the Jews here, they thought, well, we're Jewish, so we kind of got a leg up because we know Jesus' culture. We know what he's talking about a lot of times more than the Gentiles. We have advantages. You know, and some people thought just because they were Jewish, just by virtue of being Jewish, they were chosen. And it didn't matter what they did after that. And Jesus is saying, no, there's children of Israel who won't even be at the banquet. They'll be in the outer darkness. And he's commending the faith of the centurion, who's a non-Jew, because he has faith. So look, you can try and delegate responsibility to your life to other people as much as possible. But it's all a game. We are accountable for writing our own story. We have authority over our own lives. And then if you have kids, you have authority over your kids, right? Which is good. And we're kind of shifting in a direction now where parents are not exercising parental authority over the kids. And a lot of times they're outsourcing the parent aspects of the parenting of their children to mental health care professionals who are supposed to be the experts. No, you're the parent. You're the authority. And so this might help you. There's kind of two aspects you need to balance when you're parenting, and it changes as your kids age. There's care and there's control. So you care for a kid, that's all the nurturing, loving, cultivating, warm, fuzzy stuff. Control is don't run into the road because cars will kill you, you idiot, right? And you have to balance these, care and control. And when your kid's young, you have a lot of care and a lot of control. A lot of both. Why do you have a lot of control? Because kids are stupid. 2-year-olds have no impulse control. They'll run into the highway. Why? They don't even know why. Just like because it was a direction. And they just, and so you have to exercise parental control. And have, you know, I used to be against backpack leashes. Now I'm all for them. Like, I'd be for shot collars if it was okay. But turns out it's illegal. You can't do that. But imagine that a kid was just running. You would have to pull a leash. You just go like that. And I'm just kidding. So, but you got the leash and you exercise control and you pull the kid back so he doesn't go on the road. And you got to control what your kid eats, where your kid spends their time, what they're running towards, what they're running away from. You got to control everything when your kids are young, and it's exhausting. So control's high. But as your kid ages, your control should minimize and go less and less and less. And somehow the world has convinced us that our kids are made of glass and they're fragile little cupcakes and that anything they encounter that's negative is going to become trauma for them. If you want to stunt your child's growth, maintain a high level of control and keep them 2-year-olds well into their 40s. And they'll hate you for it. Because every human is supposed to grow up. But you can't not have any control over your kids. You know, some of us grew up in houses where we had no rules, we had no parents who were present, and we resent it because we feel abandoned. Because we went into a dangerous world and we got wrecked. And we didn't have an adult there telling us what was safe and what wasn't. But some parents on the other end where they can maintain high control so long that when the kids go out into the world, they can't even go out into the world. They'll be college age calling mom 10 times trying to get help for a decision about registering for classes. That's third grade action right there. And so as the kid grows, the control goes down and down. And ideally, your kid is making all their own decisions by the time they get out of high school. And then when your kid goes out into the world, there's this great quote somebody said. I don't remember who it was. As I always say, ships are safe in the harbor. But that's not what ships are for. Our ships are for journeying. And if you maintain a high level of control over your kid and you try and just over-therapize everything in their life and manage their emotional life, and you don't let them get out there and live and get beat up a little bit, you're just keeping the ship in harbor forever, and ships are for voyaging. Kids are supposed to fly. They'll wreck, but some of you are so insecure in your parenting, you can't even let your kid be disappointed because you don't know the difference between disappointed, devastated, and destroyed. And kids are supposed to experience devastation too. You know, like a boy that they fell in love with yesterday breaks up with them, they're devastated. That's good, healthy stuff. Because the world is going to throw stuff at them, and uh, kids are way more tough and resilient than you give them credit for. And many times when we overparent our kids, it has a lot more to do with our insecurity and fear of ourselves than it does them. So parental authority, you got it, use it, but gradually, lots of care, lots of love, but let the control dial back. Let your kids grow up. And again, I'll do my old grumpy grandpa thing again. Don't let them get phones until they can afford them. Okay, so we have authority over our own lives. We have a measure of control. We're responsible for our own lives. And then that circle of influence expands. And it expands to kids if you have kids. It expands to a spouse if you have a spouse. You know the Apostle Paul, the guy who wrote Galatians and books in the Bible? He didn't have a wife. And the reason he didn't have a wife is because he was so hardcore about being a church planter and pastor and preacher that he just wanted to do that all the time. And he thought, well, if I have a wife, then I got to worry about a wife. And I can't work because I'm worried about my wife. If I got a family, I got to worry about my family. And I can't work that extra time because I'll have a family. He was hardcore. Guess who did have a wife? Peter. Peter, the first pope. Ironic, huh? So the first pope had a wife. He'd take her with him on his missionary journeys. And you know, Paul's right. But for most of us, we want that worry. We want a family. We want kids. That's what we want. So your circle of authority and influence expands from yourself. A lot of times to a spouse you got to worry about, how to help them and encourage them. To family. And then at your job, you have authority differences, right? Like you got a boss at a job and you got people who work for the boss. I was talking to somebody who was younger. I'm going to sound like such a boomer right now. But I was talking to somebody who was younger, and they're saying, it's just so frustrating. Like they just keep telling me what to do every day. It's like, oh, I hate bossy people. Who's telling you what to do every day? They said, my boss. like, dude, that's how the world works. They're your supervisor. Like if I was on a job site and the foreman told me to do a job a certain way, does it matter how I feel? No. I do the job the way he wants me to do it. Doesn't matter if I think I know better. Doesn't matter if I want to do it or not. Doesn't matter if I think something else is more important. When I become a supervisor, then that's my problem. But there is authority in jobs. Let me talk about authority in church. I think it's safe to say biblically that every pastor should have absolute control over every area of your life. I'm just kidding. No. But pastors do have authority. We do have spiritual authority over the flock that God has entrusted to us. And we have to answer for God, not just for ourselves and our families, but for the spiritual condition of our flock. You know how much I would rather just swing a hammer for my life? But I am accountable for your spiritual welfare when I meet God on that day. What angle to take this from? So I do have a measure of authority over this congregation. So when does authority become abusive? That's the question, right? When does authority become abusive? Now, first, why do I have authority? One, God called me to this position, and so I'm responsible for it. Secondly, the church confirmed my call to this position. So we operate within a denomination, which means I can't just be this bully, obnoxious, annoying guy who muscles my way to the pastor position. There's this whole process with this whole college of professionals, and it interacts with the board of the congregation, and it's a long discerning process to decide who the next pastor of a congregation will be. At least that's how it works in our denomination. And so the congregation has input, the pastor's appointed, and it's a process. So just by virtue of that process, that also lends social authority to the pastor's position. Also, I know more than most of you about the Bible, not about everything. I know very little about very little, but the very little I know about very little I know. You know what I mean? And it's not because I'm smarter, it's because God has called me to this. I mean, if God has called you to be a plumber, I guarantee you know way more about plumbing than I do. And I could use your help because I have a leak in my basement bathroom right now. And I have no idea how to fix it. I've prayed, I threw the Bible at it, nothing's worked yet. So we all have the things we're called to. And I'm actually called to spiritually pastor people, which means what? Well, among other things, it means I've been educated in Bible and theology. It means that I've read lots and lots and lots, and I've thought through lots and lots when it comes to verses in the Bible, religion, theology, philosophy, and how to live a Christian life. I'll just throw this out today. This is a slow year for me. Do you guys, who uses Goodreads in here? Anybody? A couple people? Okay, it's an app that like tracks your reading. So I've read 44 books so far this year, which isn't crazy. I think a lot of pastors read about that amount. But one of the books I read was about a 160-page monograph, which evaluated the word theopneustos as it's used in parallel Greek literature and the pastoral letter. In other words, I read a whole book, hundreds of pages, about one word that happens in the Bible. Right? So I know more about that word than you do. You don't care because it's obscure, but I had a good time. So I work very hard, and all pastors should work very hard to know the Bible, to know how the Bible works, and to know how people's spiritual lives work. And I've had hours and hours and hours and hours and hours interacting with people on a spiritual level. You cannot surprise me. I've heard it all. I've heard it all. And so there's just a level of competency because God has called me to it, and I have more experience in it, and I've worked very hard at it. That also lends authority to me as a pastor in my position. However, you're still responsible for your spiritual life, right? That's part of your authority. So how do you know when the authority of the pastor goes outside the bounds that God has created for it? And some of this will be culturally determined, but some of it is biblical as well. In this passage, the centurion comes to Jesus, and he just gives Jesus full authority because he knows how it works. He goes, look, you say the word, this guy will be healed. Done. Okay, let's talk about spiritual abuse, which Jesus never did to anybody. Sometimes it's spiritual abuse. Sometimes it's just spiritual disagreement. Disagreements are going to happen in church, and they'll happen with your pastor. Church work is different than every other work. Well, not every other work. I think helping professions kind of have this. Medical professionals, educators for sure. But when people come to your office and they tell you what the diagnosis is and what should be done, and they don't know what they're talking about? Never happens to you guys? A lot of people who come to church know how church should be done, and they always think God agrees with them. Right? People in church are very opinionated, which is good. It's good to have opinions about things. It means you're thinking, or not. But, it means you care about it. Let's go with that. It means you care. So that's good. So we will definitely disagree on some things. But sometimes the disagreement will come to a point to where you can't submit to leadership anymore. And the Bible does command Christians to submit to their leadership. Not to grumble, not to cause division in a church. And some people, not just in church, but in life, they always have to be the authority. Guess what? Jesus wasn't even always the authority. You guys remember when Jesus prayed in the garden? And he said, look, this crucifixion thing sounds like a bad weekend. If it's possible, let this cup pass from me at all. And he prayed that 3 times fervently. And he went to the cross and died because that was God's will for him. And he submitted to the will of the Father. Right? So not even Jesus was an authority of all the time. And some of you, to keep yourself safe, you are the authority in every situation. And that is spiritual pride and arrogance. And it is the fastest way to get to hell, probably. It insulates you in this world, but it will not insulate you in the next. So, pastoral authority, you're supposed to submit to it, and it's not submission unless you disagree. Because if I agree with you, is anybody submitting, or are we just working together? It's no problem, right? But if it's a disagreement, we should submit. And you know what? I want to brag on Pastor Matt for a second. I didn't ask his permission, But I'm the pastor now, so I don't care. But this guy is my mentor, and I got to tell you, he's brilliant. And although people they praise his preaching, they praise a lot of things about him, what I most admire about him is probably just his pastor's heart. Like, he loves people. He really, really does. That's something I want to emulate in my own life. So I guarantee you, he knows more about how to run a church than me. I promise you. If he ran this church, it'd be, actually, we know what it would be, because he ran this church for a long time. I was going to put together a hypothetical. Well, when he ran this church, it was awesome. 2 of his services full of people. People were coming to Christ all the time. I mean, it was a great time. I got discipled in this church. He was the pastor at the time, and it was awesome. So he knows a lot. I guarantee you there's other ways he would prefer things be done than the way I do them. And at the same time, I guarantee you he's spiritual enough to let those things go because he trusts that God has called me to lead this church for the season. And so he's happy to submit to me in those things. Now we'll go off the rails. I've given him absolute permission to say, hey, you're off the rails, whack job, stop being a weirdo. He can call me out, that's fine. But nobody is more opinionated in churches than pastors and people who have formerly been in ministry. And to sit under the ministry of another person is a very chronic act of spiritual humility. And so I just want to praise Matt in front of everybody because he practices this submission I'm talking about. And he has great authority in my life that I've entrusted him with. Some of you, if you don't like the sitting arrangement, you will leave the church over that. Or if we don't like the way a song is played or the carpet color. That betrays more of a spiritual sickness in you than it does in the church. And there are people, and we pastors, we know about them, they'll just spend a couple years at churches and they'll rotate because they always end up being too good for the church they're in. Okay? So submission is a thing that's commanded in Scripture and not grumbling, and you should submit to your spiritual leadership. However, there's a line, and God will show you where this is for you. There's a line where if your spiritual leadership crosses it, you feel like they've so left the foundation of Christ that you feel like you have to choose between being faithful to Christ and being faithful to your spiritual leadership. This goes with government and civil disobedience as well. Any authority in life. Kids, you do not have permission to use this to disobey your parents. Just put that out there because you don't know stuff. But sometimes your pastor might diverge so far from foundation of Scripture or the foundation of Christ that you feel like you cannot submit to them anymore. That's when you find a new church. And I know it's a hassle, I know it's difficult, I know it's hard. But that's when spiritual disagreement gets to the point to where you're like, if I follow my pastor, I feel like I'm not following Christ anymore. That's when you should pray about getting a new church. Are you sick of the music? Are you bored? Do you feel spiritually dry? Do you not like the carpet color? Whatever, right? Like, you can write those things out. But if you really feel like your pastor is going too far afield and you can't submit to that and you're going to become divisive or it's just going to be a huge spiritual burden, then you need to carefully and prayerfully see what the new church God is calling you to is. Not the one that fits all the menus and consumer ideas that you have about what a church is. You don't go church shopping, you go church praying, and you go to different churches until God calls you to a new one. And we've had people that they just don't vibe with this church, and I'll meet with them and I'll say, I don't think you vibe either, but I know one you would vibe with. And I'll give you their name, and they go to another church, and they just find a different church that's good for them, So that's when spiritual disagreement gets to the point to where you might want to think about how to negotiate that. Spiritual abuse is not spiritual disagreement. Spiritual abuse is very different. Physical abuse is obvious, right? If I run down there and punch you, you know where the end of my body is. And you can see I violated your body with my body. It's obvious where the boundary is. Well, when I punch you emotionally, or I punch you socially through gossip, or I punch you spiritually by abusing my authority, that's harder to tell where the boundary is. Like, where's the end of the emotional fist? It's hard to see. It's all intertwined. And so it's actually a lot of times harder to recover from spiritual or emotional abuse than it is from physical abuse. Because even kids know when the parent hits them, usually they know that was wrong. But emotional abuse is something different. So, how do you know when you're being spiritually abused? Think of violation. That's where we get the word violence. If a pastor consistently violates your spiritual yard, I know this sounds weird, but go with me. If a pastor consistently violates your spiritual yard, then it's probably spiritual abuse. So, for example, I brought this up a couple weeks ago. I talked to a cousin of mine, and she asked me if she was going to hell because she cussed, because the pastor said she was going to hell because she cussed. So is that spiritual abuse or not? Well, I don't agree with it. I don't like it. That doesn't mean it's spiritual abuse. If it is spiritual abuse, what would make it spiritual abuse? It's the fact that he's using his spiritual authority to take away her responsibility of caring for her own yard. He's taking away her agency, her power to decide. He's taking away her authority. And instead, he's instituting his authority instead. So if there's a pattern in a pastor's life of violating the spiritual boundaries of you or anybody else, and they're consistently being overbearing and controlling aspects of your spiritual life, that's probably a good sign that you're being spiritually abused. If you're going into the ministry, you got to figure this out. Because people learn about God through you, and if you spiritually abuse them, when they leave you, they often feel great relief because they leave you because you were a terrible person, right? But they also can't distinguish between leaving you sometimes and leaving God. So a lot of people, they leave you or they leave the church, and when they do that, they feel this great relief. And sometimes they leave God too, and they feel relief from that because they think of God as this overbearing, domineering, spiritual, oppressive power. And for some people, faith is a burden. It's not a healing thing. It's a curse. Because a lot of you have been spiritually abused by parents or other people in your life as you grew up. So if you're going to the ministry, I'd work through that to make sure you're not a spiritually abusive person. It's important. And if you are under the authority of somebody who's spiritually abusive, get out. Get out. Do find a new church. Find mature Christians you can process this with. I would suggest some kind of spiritual counseling, spiritual direction that'll help you kind of untangle all the knots too. It's a good idea. Okay, so we have the authority you have in your life, the authority in your family and your children, authority at work. We've talked about authority in the church now, and that I have a lot of it. Kidding. Who has ultimate authority? God. You know, when Jesus is walking on water, he's not just doing a cool party trick. He's stomping the demons down and drowning them. When he casts out all those thousands of water and drives them back into the water, that's just the best slap in the face when they were trying to drown him on the way over. It's awesome. When he heals from a distance the centurion's servant, he's saying, I have the authority to honor your faith by healing somebody you care about from a distance. And at that hour, it was shown that the servant was healed. So Jesus has all authority. For now, he's delegated some of the authority in the world to other people. We've had mixed results, right? But make no mistake, there is a king to this kingdom. And Jesus isn't just giving you a bunch of good ideas for life. He's not just another self-help author on the shelf. He's God who is also king of the kingdom. And so we should live like we're the citizens of another kingdom and like we have a different authority. And a lot of us, what we've done is we've put Jesus as kind of another consultant in the line of consultants we have in our life. He's not a consultant, he's a king. And so when Jesus is king of your life, he should have ultimate authority over how you decide to live your life. And when he comes back, will there be any elections? Will there be a conversation about if we're willing to follow this guy or not? No, when he comes back and heaven comes down to earth and Jerusalem, New Jerusalem comes down to earth, and everything is remade, and there's this great walled city. Again, this is all metaphor, but it's awesome. There's this great walled city with healing and joy and light and the presence of God inside this new temple, and there's outer darkness and weeping and gnashing of teeth out there. Jesus is the King of Kings, and he's the King of the kingdom. And so now we should live like citizens of that kingdom. And so you have authority of your own life, but you should submit every aspect of your life to the ultimate authority, who is Jesus. And I'm telling you, some of you, you have Jesus as a consultant in your life. He's not just a consultant with some good ideas. He is the king who's to be obeyed. And you know what? He doesn't have to walk all the way over to the house to do it. Wherever you're at, he can heal from there. Wherever you're at, he can speak miracles from there because he has authority to do so. So, church, as we move into communion now, and we take the elements, my prayer is that you can spend some time with the Lord, and my prayer is that you would recognize Jesus as the ultimate authority in your life. Some of us, we've been answering to other things. We've been answering to our insecurities. We've been answering to expectations of other people. We've been letting other people write our story. But I pray that you would line everything in your life up with the authority of Jesus himself. You guys can go ahead and come forward and distribute the elements. So spend a moment in prayer, and then in a minute we'll take communion together. Lord Jesus, I thank you so much that you are the King of Kings and that you are the ultimate authority. Show us now as we spend a moment with you. Areas in our life where we've just treated you like a consultant or we've ignored you altogether. Show us areas of our life where we haven't taken responsibility as the author when we should. And help us to line up our lives with your calling on us.